some of your most recent work. And so for those who don't know Jens previously, Jens has a remarkable biography, so this will take at least half a minute to do. So Jens is the Edwin A. and Betty L. Bergman Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. He's also the Pritzker Director of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, which is very similar in some ways to the Youth Endowment Fund, and we're honoured to try and match the work that you've done there, and co-director of the Education Lab, both of which have played absolutely key roles.
Oh, hello.
Oh, Harriet, if you just mute yourself, that would be absolutely super. There we go. Both of which have played absolutely key roles in influencing social and policy change. He's the co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Working Group on the Economics of Crime. He's on the editorial board of the American Economic Review. I've got a list of all the journals here that you've been published in, Jens, but I don't think we've got time for me to read them all out. There's a great number of books that Jens has also co-authored or co-edited. But also really important to the Youth Endowment Fund, Jens's work has really influenced practice, and you can see that in work in New York, in Chicago, and much wider. But he's also the co-author of absolutely fascinating new paper entitled "Does Nothing Stop a Bullet Like a Job? What are the effects of income on crime?" And I had the joy of meeting Jens a couple of months ago, and was really keen to ask him to come and share some of the insights in that paper and in his wider work. So Jens, I'll hand over to you, and very much in your hands, and I'm sure we'll ask a suite of questions your way, perhaps when you come to an end. But over to you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, John, for the very kind introduction. If I fail to successfully share my slides now, I'll undermine the entire credibility of your introduction. And thanks for having me and everybody for coming to this. What I wanted to do is I wanted to talk a little bit about the maybe counterintuitive, or at least counterintuitive to me, evidence about the effects of income on crime, violent crime specifically, which is the most important part of the crime problem from the public's perspective in terms of what the public cares about. And then pivot to why I think that relationship is so counterintuitive and what might be going on instead. And I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. And if my American accent is too thick at any point of this and you can't understand what I'm saying, just chime in with clarifying questions as we go. Okay. So can everybody see my screen?
Absolutely perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. So whoops. I messed it up right out of the gate. There we go. Okay. So as you all know much better than I, we have very different violence concerns in the US versus the UK, but as you know, even though your problem is very different, it is very much a concern on the public's radar there. I'm sure you're all familiar with the survey data saying something like half of young people are really concerned about knife crime. Lots of questions about whether this is a problem that can be solved or not. John and I were just talking before we started about the new Labor government declaring that they were going to try and cut knife crime in half over the next decade. And John was wondering if that is ridiculously ambitious to the point of impossibility. And I want to suggest that at least from the US experience, and I think what we've been learning about violent behavior over time, maybe it's not as unattainable a goal as one might have originally imagined. So what I want to argue, the big thing that I want to argue here is that a lot of the limitations of previous policy approaches to the problem of violence in different countries is due to our having framed the problem incorrectly. So this slide is an economist's attempt at humor. This is about as funny as it's going to get. So just to calibrate expectations for the rest of the talk. So I think we've been thinking about the problem the wrong way, and I want to make an argument. We'll see if you find it persuasive, but I want to try and make an argument for what a different, maybe more accurate and I think ultimately optimistic take on the problem is. Okay. So, how have we been framing the problem? Let me start with how we think about this in the U.S., where I know the survey data better, and then argue that you see signs of similar public understanding of the crime and violence problem in the UK context as well. So here's some survey data from the US. You know, there are more surveys that ask the public what they think should be done about crime than ask the public what the public thinks causes crime. But I have tracked down a bunch of surveys in the US context that ask the public, what do you think is driving the crime problem? And this snapshot of surveys goes up through 1994. 1994 is when President Bill Clinton signed the largest crime bill in US history. So what were people thinking at that time? And here's some candidate responses for what the public might say causes the crime problem. And if you look at the 1994 data, you can see 20% of people say the criminal justice system is just too lenient. 30% say crisis of personal values. 20% say drugs. And in the US context, people view drug use and drug abuse through a moral lens. We Americans tend to think that drug use is a reflection of poor character. So one way to think about this is essentially 70% of Americans say the crime problem is due to characterologically bad people and the failure of the criminal justice system to stop them. That's really been the dominant conception of the crime and violence problem in the US for decades and decades. And if there is a contender explanation, what is the second most common explanation? It really is sort of a root cause explanation. Now, the fraction of Americans who say root causes are the most important cause of crime and violence ebbs and flows, but over time. But that's basically the second most important explanation. So those two things together basically account for the majority of Americans' views about the crime and violence problem. And as I say, I think you see echoes of that in the UK context. You see a rise in knife crime. There's a lot of public discussion about cracking down on a criminal justice crackdown. That's very consistent with an attribution of the violence problem to characterologically bad people. You know, we don't think that we can change people's character. The only thing that you can do is a criminal justice response, catch them and lock them up. And you also see lots of news coverage in the UK context, as you all know much better than I, about, well, maybe the solution to this is really root causes. We should solve the poverty problem instead. Okay. And so with that as our frame of the crime and violence problem, we can sort of ask how well has that conception of the problem been going? Okay. And, you know, we can start with the US as a case study, you know, the sort of ghost of Christmas future for any country thinking of a criminal justice crackdown strategy. At the risk of some hometown pride here, I can say the United States is absolutely world class at cracking down on crime and violence. As you can see in this graph, our incarceration rate per 100,000 people is absolutely unparalleled among advanced countries in the world. Has that succeeded in making the United States safe? Well, if you look at the best measured crime and the most serious crime in terms of social harms, murder rates, you can see that the United States is, depending on the year, something on the order of 4, 5, 6, 7 times per 100,000 the rate that you see in the United Kingdom. So the get tough approach is not self-evidently, obviously there are differences across countries and social conditions, but I think there's an accumulating body of rigorous empirical evidence that supports the idea that the get tough approach has real limits in terms of its effectiveness. What about the focus instead on fixing poverty and related root causes of crime and violence? Well, you know, coming from the U.S. context, the natural place to look for starters is the biggest natural experiment that we had in the U.S., which was the war on poverty over the course of the 1960s. So for those of you who are not avid you know, hobbyist readers of U.S. social policy history, and early to mid 1960s, President Johnson, who takes over the White House on the heels of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, The centerpiece of his public policy plan is a war on poverty that's going to end poverty in the United States. He points out that one of the big secondary benefits of that will be to strike at the root causes of crime and violence in America. And, you know, by many measures, the war on poverty and the economic tailwind that we had in the United States over the 1960s was remarkably successful. You can see we entered the 1960s with an official poverty rate on the order of 22%. And by the end of the decade, the poverty rate was something like half of that. So what was the consequence for violent crime in the United States? You can see that the murder rate, effectively measured on the right-hand side y-axis, the murder rate over this period roughly doubled at the same time that the poverty rate. Now, there are other things that are changing over time in the baby boomer cohort is coming of age. There are other social changes going on, but this is just to say that at first blush, you look at the empirical evidence and you would say, at the very least here, you would say, if poverty were to be a driver of violence, it's clearly not powerful enough to overcome other things that are changing over time. So what do other data points then tell us about the role of poverty, the link between poverty and violent crime? Here's an updated, from data from recent years, very close to home. This is a graph of Chicago we have 77 official neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. And what I've done is I've graphed the number of shooting victims per 100,000 on the y-axis. If from the UK context, you reflect on the magnitude of the range here, you will be shocked and astonished, and I can assure you that I've made no mistake in the calculations. This is what the actual data look like for Chicago. And then on the x-axis here, I've plotted median household income for each of the neighborhoods. Okay, now, why are so many people convinced that poverty, that nothing stops a bullet like a job, that poverty really is the key root cause of violent crime? It's not surprising when you think that about why so many people believe this. You know, if you just look around the city of Chicago, the first stylized fact that is not lost on anyone who lives here is that literally every single rich area in Chicago is very safe. You can see that they're all of the neighborhoods that are to the right on the median household income distribution are very low on the y-axis, have very low shooting rates. And similarly, all of the high violence neighborhoods in the Chicago area are poor. So when you're when you're driving through Lincoln Park on the north side of Chicago to go to some fancy dinner to celebrate your wife's birthday or your husband's birthday, you are very aware that it's an incredibly affluent and incredibly safe neighborhood. And when you're picking up the newspaper and you're reading about where all the shootings are in Chicago, you are aware that they're all concentrated in the most economically disadvantaged South and West Side neighborhoods. So there are pieces to the story that make a lot of sense here. What you don't see so clearly from casual empiricism day to day is the enormous variation in gun violence rates within low-income neighborhoods, right? So if you just think about, like, if you look at the neighborhoods that have like a median household income of like $30,000 a year-ish, okay, that's consistent with a shooting rate of 100 or nearly 1,000 at the exact same income level. Okay. And so what that starts to suggest is, like, one thing that shows is, for sure, poverty does not have a deterministic relationship to violence. There are lots and lots of high poverty neighborhoods that have relatively low violence rates. And the hypothesis then that also starts to raise is, are we seeing in this sort of graph, are we seeing reflection of a causal effect of poverty on violence, or are we seeing signs of some other social factor that is correlated with poverty but is not poverty per se? And that becomes very, if it's something that's correlated with poverty, but not poverty per se, that other thing, whatever it might be, might in principle be more amenable to policy intervention than poverty, which has turned out to be a very hard problem for the United States to make progress on since the 1960s. Okay. So you might be looking at this and think this is great for Chicago. Chicago's a weird place. What does this have to do with the United Kingdom or anywhere else? And so it's interesting to see that you see a similar sort of J curve or backward J curve when you look at country level data and country level murder rates. You can see that with the exception of the United States, every rich country is very safe. You can see that all of the incredibly high violence neighborhoods are poor. And you can also see that there is an incredible variation across low income countries in their murder rate per capita, right? So at the same per capita income, you could be India or you could be Honduras with a murder rate that's 8 times as high, right? So lots and lots of variability in violence rates across countries, not just across neighborhoods within a city, that can't be explained by income per capita or poverty. Okay, so all of this is sort of descriptive and suggestive, and so somebody trained as an economist, economists have become either appropriately sensitized to the distinction between correlation and causation over time, or irritating randomistas, depending on your perspective. People who just relentlessly focus on randomized experiments and natural experiments to tease apart cause and effect. What happens if you look at the sort of evidence, the sort of causal evidence that economists tend to focus on? So Amanda Agin at Cornell carried out a really interesting study where she looks at people exiting prison in different states at different points in time. And what's interesting about that sort of natural experiment is that across states and within a state over time, there are differences in both economic conditions and the generosity of social programs when people are leaving prison. And so you can ask, what happens to crime rates when somebody leaves prison when economic conditions are good and or social programs are more generous relative to when you exit prison when social programs are less generous or economic conditions are relatively bad? And what you can see is when people have more income, there's so what I'm showing you here is the little blue triangle here is the estimated effect in standard deviation units. And then I'm showing you the 95% confidence interval around that estimate. And you can see that when people have more income exiting prison, they're less likely to commit property crime. You can see that they're less likely to commit drug crime. You can see that they're not less likely to commit violent crime. Okay, so that's sort of interesting causal data point number one. You might look at that and say, well, people exiting prison might be a weird population. This is, maybe there's something about these data. And so what we also did in the paper that John mentioned to start with is we reviewed all of the studies that we could find that met our criteria for causal inference. And this is job programs. It's what we call macro evidence, is studies that are using naturally occurring variation in macroeconomic conditions. And then studies of transfer programs, that is means tested social programs that give resources to low income populations. And when you look at property offending, you can see that there are a bunch of studies that, consistent with Amanda Agin's study, you can see that there are a bunch of papers that show that when people have more money in their pockets, they're less likely to engage in property crime. That's very much not the case when you look at violent crimes. Okay, so I think I'm very happy to take questions about this at the end, but I think that there's a very strong empirical case to make that's a little bit counterintuitive, which is that giving people additional resources reduces their rate of property offending, to some extent drug offending as well. It doesn't seem to move the needle on violent crime. And again, I think from a public policy perspective, that's a really big concern, because it's violent crime that is the thing that ruins families, ruins communities, and generates huge social harms, in part through costly avoidance behavior. In the US context, it's violent crime. That's the reason that people flee cities, why they're afraid to go outside at night, and so on. Okay. Um, and you can also see, sorry, by way of taking stock of how this is going, I think that this is an accurate graph for the trend in, John, you can correct me, or somebody else can correct me if the internet has led me astray here. But I think that this is reputable data on the murder rate per capita or per million in the UK, or sorry, in England and Wales. Specifically, you can see that there's a little bit of a rise, a little bit of a dip, but if you're looking at the long-term trend here, I think it's safe to say that England and Wales at least have not solved the violence problem. Right. This is whatever we've been doing in the past in England and Wales at least has not. This is not a problem of yesteryear. This is a very active sort of challenge that we don't understand the solution to. So I want to, by way now, so I hope that I've convinced you of the basic empirical fact. What I want to do next is I want to offer some thoughts about an explanation for that empirical fact that might then open the door to a different way of thinking about violent behavior that then opens the door to a very different suite of potential policy responses. Okay, so I think the place to start is I want to, if you sort of, I don't know if the United Kingdom is as politically hyperpolarized as the US right now. Tautologically, there's no way you could be more hyperpolarized than the United States right now, but I'm open to the possibility that you are as hyperpolarized. So in a world in which like nobody in the United States agrees on anything, including like criminal justice policy, it is striking that there is a shared implicit assumption in the sort of get tough approach that's typically characteristic of people on the political right, and the root cause approach that's typically found among people on the left. So if you sort of think about, if you're on the right and you think the solution is to crack down, what you're basically arguing is what we need to do is increase the negative incentives, the sticks that people face for engaging in crime. And if you're on the left, what you're arguing is we need to address the root causes. We need to make formal work more lucrative for people to increase the opportunity cost of engaging in crime. So people now have more to lose when we make carrots more generous. Social programs that they might lose if they get arrested, or jobs. Notice the implicit shared assumption here, which is that whenever somebody is about to engage in crime, they are engaging in a sort of rational benefit cost calculation, right? So both sides in this debate have conceived of the problem of violence as one of deliberate intentions, okay? And that's where I want to argue we might be making the sort of the key mistake. Okay, so, given the limits to that way of thinking, I think it's at least worth considering whether there's a different way to think about the problem that might lead us to a different sort of policy direction as well. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to offer a different view of why people commit violence, and I want to start off by suggesting that violent crime itself is different from what many people think. So in the US context, it's not knife violence, it's so much as gun violence. In the US, knife violence would be counted, if the problem we were worried about in the US context was knife violence, we would declare that as a success. So gun violence is the problem that we have here. Most Americans, what they know about gun violence comes from watching the news and consuming entertainment. And the image that you have here, consistent with the idea that the problem is either bad people or bad economic conditions, like the canonical sort of mental image people have is like from The Wire. I don't know if people in the UK have watched The Wire. I hope everybody has. It's like a gang war over drug selling turf, right? It's rational in its way. It's instrumental. It's over money, that sort of thing. But that actually is not what most lethal violence is, at least in the US context. And I'd be very curious to know if this is similar in the UK context. So here's what most gun violence in the United States looks like. This is a more or less randomly selected shooting from the city of Chicago, just a couple of miles away from my office here at the University of Chicago on the south side of the city. June 2nd, 2012 is a Saturday at 3 in the afternoon. There were two groups of teenagers in the middle of the street at 73rd and Coles Avenue in the South Shore neighborhood, arguing about whether a kid in one of the groups had stolen a used bike from a kid in one of the other groups. So the two groups are starting to separate, so there's no self-defense rationale for what happens next, which is that somebody pulls a Glock 9mm from their waistband, fires into the other group, and hits a 16-year-old kid in the chest who then dies. Now, that makes absolutely no sense from either of the conventional wisdoms of the violence problem, right? So it's a crowded street at 3 in the afternoon. Even in a city with as dysfunctional a criminal justice system as Chicago, if you commit murder in broad daylight on a crowded street, you will get caught, as the 17-year-old offender soon was, and he's spending the rest of his life in a Illinois Department of Correctional facility now. So 2 lives were thrown away that day, not just one. So it doesn't make any sense from the perspective of the negative incentives were inadequate there. And the flip side is, surely this can't be about poverty, because, if you go onto the internet, you can get a used bike on the south side of Chicago for 10 or 20 bucks, right? So it makes no sense to risk a life in prison term for a $10 or $20 used bike. So, and this is actually what most murders in Chicago and the US as a whole, for that matter, look like, right? So a very small share are related to sex offenses in Chicago. Something like 1 in 5 of the murders in Chicago are what criminologists call instrumental. The violence is incidental to the main purpose of the act, like in furtherance of a robbery or a gang war over drug selling turf. And for something like 80% of murders, the violence itself is the point. You are pissed against somebody else. You want to inflict harm on them. It's an altercation that ends in tragedy because someone's got a weapon, right? And so, what I like to say in the US context, and I suspect that there's a version of this is true in the UK as well, the United States doesn't have a crime problem so much as a gun violence problem, because that's what the public mostly cares about. And we don't really have a gun violence problem so much as we have an arguments with gun problem, right? Most of these shootings are heated words over whatever it is. That could have been de-escalated at multiple points in the back and forth between both parties, and it's not. And then it ends in tragedy because someone's got a gun in the US context, or a knife or a bicycle spoke or whatever in the UK context, right? Okay. And so what I want to do then is so how do we make sense of why these arguments sort of escalate and end in violence? So if I was there in person rather than doing this over Teams, I would do a little audience participation exercise that I'll talk you through instead of doing it, because it's not going to work over Teams. So if we were in person, what I would say is I'm going to talk you through an audience participation exercise where I want you to call out the color of the object in the middle of the slide. I do a little practice run like this first. You're supposed to say black. Very few of you would say anything. I'd make some joke that would make fun of you to try and shame you into participating. I'd say, now, this is only going to work if you're really engaged. I'd do it really quickly. You guys would say black, you'd say red, you'd say green, you'd say yellow, and then most of you would say blue. Rather than follow the prompt to the task, which is to say orange instead. So what's going on there? So if you've taken a psychology class at any point in your lives, you might recognize this as something called the Stroop test. It's one of the most famous tests in psychology, what is the Stroop test illustrating? The Stroop test is illustrating the core idea at the heart of modern behavioral science and psychology, very nicely summarized in the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman, that our brains work in two different ways. There are two types of cognition or thinking that we all engage in, of which we are only aware of one. So there is the conscious thought, the voice in your head, that Kahneman and other psychologists call system two. This is the deliberate, thoughtful, rational kind of thinking that we normally think of as thinking. The problem with that type of cognition or that type of thinking is that it is very effortful, right? It is slow and it's effortful. And because it is mentally draining, our minds are designed to do as little of it as possible. And so over the course of human evolution, the way the mind has developed is we develop a series of automatic responses that are quick and low effort that we deploy to deal with routine situations that we see over and over again. And Kahneman and other psychologists call that system one. And what the Stroop test is illustrating is that your system one responses that normally work well for you in routine, usual situations can lead you astray when you encounter an out of the ordinary situation, right? So how does that work in the Stroop test? Well, here's a common situation that you see over and over again in daily life. You see text, printed text everywhere, on billboards, on your computer screen, newspaper headlines when you're walking by the newsstand, walking through Paddington Station from the train on your commute, whatever it is. You don't deliberately, consciously, when you see a billboard, you don't consciously think to yourself, should I read that? You just read it, right? So what's going on there is you've developed an automatic system one response that is usually adaptive. It's usually helpful to you in daily life. See word, read word, right? And the problem with that system one response is that it can be overgeneralized. The Stroop test puts you in a situation that looks like a normal situation, but the right response is different. In the Stroop test, you see word, that's a familiar situation, but the response is now different in this unusual setting. You should say the color instead. Okay, that's what the Stroop test is illustrating. So what does that have to do with gun violence? One of the things that we've learned from social science research, from talking to social workers and school administrators and police officers and judges and juvenile probation officers and kids out on the street, from visiting, Chicago South and West Side neighborhoods and going to Baltimore and New York City and on, is we know, and I'd be surprised if a version of this wasn't true in the UK as well. We know that unfortunately in many low income, high violence communities, social order has basically broken down. The adults in the community who, would normally help young people deal with problems are overwhelmed. Like, to me, the big aha moment of this was I was driving around one Friday night with the commander of the Englewood Police District here on the south side of Chicago. Englewood is one of the most violent neighborhoods in a very, very violent city. And we're driving down 63rd Street, which is like the main commercial drag in Englewood. And the car in front of us is a 2-lane each way road, and he's swerving across all 4 lanes in front of us. And the commander's response is not to turn on his lights and pull the guy over, but to slam on the brakes to put as much distance between us and the other car as possible. And I turned to the commander and I said, I don't want to tell you your business, but I think that guy is drunk off his ass. And the commander said, I think you're right. And I said, aren't you going to do anything? And he said, if I pulled over every drunk driver in Chicago, in Englewood, I wouldn't have time to deal with the big problem that we have here, which is gun violence, right? So now imagine, so kids learn in these neighborhoods that they're basically on their own, and they develop a system one response that is normally adaptive for them, that says when they get challenged, which they get challenged over and over again, They learned that the adaptive automatic response is when you get challenged, push back. If I'm walking to school and someone demands my lunch money, if I give them the lunch money today, tomorrow they're coming back for my jacket, and the day after that, they're coming back from the phone. So my pushing back against the provocation is not retaliation for what you just did to me. It is deterrence established at a retail level in the eyes of everybody else in the community to signal that I'm not an easy victim. So my response does not need to be proportional to the level of provocation that you just instigated. The main thing I'm trying to do is signal that I'm not someone to be messed with. That automatic response might be adaptive for most situations that you see every day, but can lead to trouble when it's overgeneralized, like when someone's got a semi-automatic 9mm handgun in their waistband. That is, in a nutshell, the behavioral science theory of what's going on with gun violence. It is not deliberate system 2 cognition, like deliberate intentions, people doing benefit cost analyses. It is system 1 leading you astray in this heated back and forth argument with somebody else out on the street. And then that leads you to a cycle of retaliatory violence back and forth once somebody's injured somebody else as part of an argument. Okay. If I was there in person, I'd also tell a corny joke about me having done this in Sweden and realizing that the last slide should have been this instead of blue. I'd also tell you an interesting story about how when the CIA at the height of the Cold War was screening job applicants, they wanted to screen out potential Russian spies. So they'd administer the Stroop test, and this would be the last image in the Stroop test. This, I am told, is the Russian word for blue. The only person who would say whatever the Russian word for blue is instead of orange is of course a native Russian language speaker. So so all I've done so far basically is just tell you a story. Okay, all I've done so far is tell you a story, and you should be skeptical. You should be skeptical. You should say, look, this is a huge social problem that a lot of people have spent a lot of time worrying about, and we've spent a huge amount of money trying to do something about. And now you've got this story that it's some like totally different thing. How do I know that this is just not some sort of, that there's something to this? So I'm an empiricist by heart. I'm an empirical economist. So I was skeptical myself. So I wanted to see if there's something to this. And so we partnered with a nonprofit in Chicago called Youth Guidance to test one of their programs called Becoming a Man. I'll just very quickly talk you through the first exercise of Becoming a Man. They bring 12 middle school or high school kids on the south side of Chicago together in school into this BAM program. And there's an adult program facilitator. The very first exercise they do is called the fist. They pair the kids up. So like John and I would be a pair. They would say, they'd give John the ball. They'd say, Jens, here's the exercise. You have 30 seconds to get the ball out of John's hands. The only rule is there are no rules. Go. So these are middle school, high school age kids. They do what you would expect. They just beat the crap out of each other for 30 seconds. I might try and pry John's hand open. He doesn't open his hand. I might break his pinky. Then I start punching him in the stomach. Then I bite his ear. I put him in a headlock. The program counselor calls time. Program counselor then switches the ball to my hand, gives John 30 seconds. He does the same thing to me. Then we reconvene to debrief. The program counselor says, Jens, tell me about the strategies that you tried. I said, well, I started off trying to pry his hand open. I broke his finger. He's stronger than he looks. I couldn't get the ball. Then I punched him a couple times. I got him in a headlock. I might have bitten his ear. I can't remember. None of it worked. And then the program counselor will say, very interesting. Why didn't you ask him for the ball? So Youth Guidance has now literally done this with something like 10 or 12,000 kids over the last decade that they've been doing the program. And when you talk to the Youth Guidance program providers, they say like out of 10,000, like literally not more than a dozen kids ever think to ask, right? Very consistent with, right? So then the program provider then will say, why didn't you ask? And I'll say, well, if I would have asked, John would have thought I was A, and you can imagine what the kid says. And then the kicker to the exercise is the program provider will then turn to John and say, John, what would you have done if Jens had asked for the ball? And most of the kids in John's situation will say, I would have just given him the ball. It's just a stupid rubber ball. It's much better than having my pinky broken, being punched in the stomach a couple times, having this creepy guy bite my ear and whatever else, right? You can see what the program is doing. It's, first of all, what's very important about it is that it is show, not tell. It is not giving a lecture about system 1 and system 2. It is putting kids in a scenario and then holding up a mirror to their own behavior to get them to see how their system 1 responses can be overgeneralized and lead to problems. Okay. So it's a bunch of exercises like that. I think about it as trying to get kids to recognize the high stakes situations that are non-routine, high stakes. Those are the moments when you need to take that extra second, exert that extra mental effort to do a little bit more system 2 deliberate cognition. That's how I think about what the program is basically doing. Does it work? Well, we carried out a large scale randomized control trial in Chicago. 2 different control trials with over 2,000 kids each. We randomized kids to a program and a control group. We measure their violent crime outcomes using Chicago Police Department arrest data. And you can see that the program basically cuts their violent crime rates in half. Okay, so going back to like the labor government's goal of cutting knife crime in half, is that technologically possible? As I'll mention in a second, there are challenges. We need to figure out a way to come up with the money, right, to deliver this, and we need to figure out a way to successfully scale the programs. But do we have an example of a rigorously tested policy that can cut violent behavior by young people in half? Yes, we do. Right? That 50% reductions are not beyond our scientific understanding of what is capable to achieve. You might say, well, yeah, those are kids that are, this is an experiment done in the Chicago public schools. Those kids are still in school. Maybe the highest risk kids aren't susceptible to this sort of intervention. So we did a version of BAM. We did a randomized control trial of a version of BAM inside the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, where the highest risk kids in the juvenile justice system's eyes are held, and we see a statistically significant change in behavior and recidivism in that case. And notice there's so what BAM and BAM-like programs are basically trying to do is they're trying to help people recognize when they should be less system 1 and help them de-escalate themselves by being a little bit more system 2. The behavioral science perspective on violence says there's a complementary strategy that you could use as well, which is when somebody is being too system 1 in a high stakes situation that could lead to violence, have some outside adult step in and de-escalate, right? And notice that sort of violence interruption makes no sense if you think that violence is caused by bad economic conditions or characterologically bad people, because bad economic conditions and characterologically bad people, that implies persistent motivation for violence. So under the conventional wisdom, violence interrupted is merely violence delayed. Under the behavioral science perspective, where it's a fleeting system 1 cognition, violence interrupted can be violence prevented. Okay, so here is, I think, just to recap, here I think are the 2 approaches to violence, the 2 complementary approaches, policy approaches to preventing violence under this behavioral perspective, is there are programs that work, social programs that work with people in advance, and I would count primary and secondary schooling as a key part of that as well. There's evidence to suggest this is part of what schooling does. Programs that work with people in advance of high stakes, potentially violent situations to help them to do a better job of thinking about their thinking is one way to think about it. Get them to be more system 2 in key situations. And then there are a bunch of policies that change the likelihood that some pro-social adult is nearby when conflict is brewing, and the adult can then step in and help de-escalate it from the outside. And that includes community violence intervention groups like Violence Interruption. It also includes things like cleaning up vacant lots. The data show that when you clean up vacant lots, that gets more people out in public. Jane Jacobs would call that eyes on the street. That's what happens when you open new retail stores in economically depressed areas. It generates more foot traffic. That's what happens when you improve street lighting in a community. That's what happens when you hire more police. So if you just looked at these different policies here, you would say, what a weird laundry list of disconnected things. But the behavioral science perspective on violence lets you look at this mishmash of policies and say, oh, I see, they're all acting on the same underlying principle of what's driving violent behavior. Now, as I mentioned, there are key scientific and policy challenges to solve, right? This is a graph that shows you the effect of BAM in Chicago as it scaled. So the x-axis here is the number of kids who are getting BAM in the different RCTs that we consider. So this is schooling outcomes in the top graph, where you want it to be a larger positive number. You can see it was really big in our first smaller scale experiment, and then it seemed to attenuate as the program got bigger. The second and the third graphs are arrests. You want those to be negative numbers. You can see that they were really big negative numbers when the program was small that we had difficulty preserving as the program got bigger, right? So this is a generic challenge in social policy, like how do we scale things? So we don't exactly have the button to push for at-scale impact right now, but we can at least start to see a more productive direction in which we should be going now. So like the last thing that I'll just close with, and I'd love your questions and comments, is I think the core idea for me was, the key aha moment. I was inside the juvenile detention center talking to a staff member who said, I tell the kids in here all the time, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here, right? So it's not a problem of bad kids. It's not just a problem of bad economic conditions. It's really a problem of bad decisions made in high stakes situations. Thanks for your time and your patience. Let me turn it over to John to MC the questions.
Yes, that was absolutely fascinating and fantastic. So thank you so very much. If you'd like to ask Jens a question, do just stick up your sort of digital hand, and I will. I'll pull you in. I might take chair's privilege just to throw one your way, Jens, just to kick us off, and then I'll pull in everyone if I can. Can I ask about? I mean, there's so much for those who want to read Jens's paper do as well, because there's so many examples of like particular studies that have been done which found this effect on property crime but no effect on violent crime. And so you very kindly sort of didn't go for every one example, but there is quite a lot of data that's sort of backing up your argument. The question I wanted to ask was about summer jobs. Like, so you in the paper you noticed that it's odd, like the provision of jobs to teenagers seems to be having some effect on reducing violence. So not cash, but jobs, which comes with a bit of cash. And the effect of violence seems to continue to decline after they're not getting the money anymore. And so I'm just curious as to what you thought was going on.
Yeah, thank you for the question, John. So this in many ways is one of the most counterintuitive findings within the research literature. So one of the patterns that we consistently see in the data is that when you give a job of any sort to an adult, so let's start with adults and then I'll come to, so John, you were referring to youth summer jobs, just to make that explicit. Yeah. So when you look at jobs programs for adults, the evidence is very consistent that has no effect on violent crime. But then as John mentions, like surprisingly, in light of the evidence for adults, surprisingly, when you give some youth jobs over the summer, you consistently see amazing results in terms of reduced youth violent behavior. And so you look at that and you say, like, how in the world, for starters, I'm just enriching, like elaborating the question a little bit, right? Like, how can it be that a job to an adult doesn't do any good and a job to a kid does good in reducing violence. And so I think the best hypothesis that I have here for what's going on um, is that for youth, for teenagers, a summer job is really a human capital intervention rather than a a jobs program in some sense, right? The job is teaching kids skills, and the evidence that we have for that is two crime lab alumni who are now professors at Michigan and Oregon respectively, Sarah Heller and John Davis, did a study looking at different subgroups of teens who were in these summer jobs programs. And the kids who benefit economically the most from getting a teen summer job in terms of like follow-on employment and so on, those are not the kids who are showing the biggest drops in violent crime from the summer job. It's the other kids who aren't showing the big economic benefits that are showing the biggest drop in violent crime. And so I think a plausible explanation for what's going on is that it's developing some sort of human capital very broadly defined. And I think the more we could find out what that is, the better we'd be able to sort of refine our policies to do more of that specifically.
Yeah, because I've wondered about the socialization effect. You're suddenly in a different environment where the type 1 instinct isn't to respond, it's to do something, it's to be forgiving. And let me bring others in. So if you want to just come off mute and bring your camera up so we can see you, and it's a lot to have to do. That'd be super. Why don't we bring in Pete and Keir, and I'll see if I can get Nick in as well. Pete.
Thanks, Jens. Thanks for the talk and the paper. It's really useful to have some of the evidence set out like this, and really challenging of assumptions. I think one of the sort of difficulties I'm having, and the thing I'm wrestling with, is I think that a claim you could make about poverty is there's something about the kind of long-term experience of it and the associated stresses and difficulties which isn't captured in the RCTs of these kind of short-term cash interventions. The intervention studies you cite, my understanding, they do tend to be short term. I mean, it could be up to a year injections as provision of cash, and that just doesn't quite capture something, I think, in the root causes explanation, which is that there's sort of long-term sustained experience of poverty and its stresses and difficulties can make it harder to do that kind of type 2 style thinking. I'm really interested in your response to that.
Let me bring Keir in as well, Jens. I might line up a few questions if that's okay. Keir, great to have you with us.
Thanks. Thanks again, Jens. My question was actually Peter's, so I'm really glad Peter's asked that, because it gets means I can ask another one. So you brought up a chart, Jens, with the communities from a particular neighbourhood, and showed that there's a real variation at the bottom level in terms of levels of violence when income is relatively low. I guess my question is, if your theory is that the driver behind a lot of violence is arguments plus weapons and system 1 thinking, why is it that that's so prevalent in some of those neighbourhoods and not in others?
Fantastic. And let me try and bring Nick in as well, and then we'll do 3. And then, John, if I can bring you in, I'd love to. Nick.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting presentation. I guess my question was around where we should be focusing our efforts in terms of intervention type. And I think the effect sizes you show for BAM are very impressive, but they're also very unusual for psychosocial programs. Even targeted programs, effect sizes are often much smaller. And as you demonstrated, that when things start to get implemented outside of trials, effect sizes often go down. And I think in this country, we've been quite good at promoting social and emotional learning programs, the kind of programs that promote the think slow type mentality. And where we've been less good is at trying to do stuff around families' material financial situation, which, as we know, contributes to all the loads of risk factors for violence and crime and so on. So my sense is we've gone one way, we need to bring it back. The pendulum needs to come back the other way, but we're interested in your thoughts on that.
Jens, over to you.
Okay, perfect. So, I think that, let me make two quick comments in response to the question of like, essentially, like, wouldn't giving families cash have bigger long-term effects on kids because of all of the like developmental benefits from, and I think one quick policy observation that I would say is like, as a logical matter that is possible. I'll talk about what the evidence says on that in 1 second. But even if that were true, notice then that we as scientists have an obligation to tell the policymakers, like, if you are worried about controlling violence over the next 5-year window, cash transfers are not, you need to realize that you are signing up for a 10-year crime benefit here, not a 2 years from now crime benefit, in the spirit of scientific transparency with the policy community. But it turns out that it's not clear that that is true. Again, counterintuitively so, right? I was part of a research study in Chicago that looked at what happens when you give families transfers that increase household income by something like 50%. We had gigantic sample sizes, something like 80,000 families were randomized to get the help versus not get the help. We could track kids up for something like 10 or 12 years, and we had very precisely estimated zero impacts on criminal behavior for the kids. I was very surprised, right? Like, this is not what I went in expecting myself. So I think your speculation is exactly what I had speculated as well, but it turns out not to be what you see in the data. What is going on within the poor neighborhoods over time? I think, there's a bunch of research in sociology that shows people like Rob Sampson at Harvard and Steve Rodenbush at the University of Chicago have shown that there's a huge amount of variability within poor neighborhoods in the degree of like informal social control or collective efficacy or whatever you would want to call it, the number of adults who are out in the neighborhood and willing to step in and intervene when something is brewing. And part of that has to do with like the social climate of the neighborhood. And part of that, as Jane Jacobs like noted 50 or 60 years ago, part of that also has to do with the built environment as well. In neighborhoods where there's a lot of retail mixed in with residential, there are more people, more adults walking around and able to then step in and intervene and so on. And so I think that is my hypothesis for what's going on to explain the variation within poor neighborhoods. And then finally, the comment about we've done a lot of this in the socio-emotional learning space. Like I worry that we have under-conceptualized a lot of the interventions in this space. I think if you think about how to prevent somebody from having an anger response, like one way to do that, in principle, one way to do that is like you just provoke them over and over and give them practice not getting pissed off. A different way that you could do that is to help them reconstrue the stimulus so they don't get pissed off in the first place. And I don't think that we have understood sort of the micro foundations of the decision-making process behind violence well enough behind a bunch of these interventions. And I think a lot of these things are like socio-emotional learning interventions very widely in my experience and have very sort of loose theories about what they're trying to do. And so I personally am not surprised that they don't have a track record of great success. I think the closer the intervention design sits with cognitive psychology and our understanding of human decision-making, I think the more promising the policy responses. Sorry, John, those were long responses to three great questions, and I've filibustered out most of the time. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. I know that Jens's next commitment is to have a one-to-one catch up with me. So on that basis, I might just let us go just a couple of minutes long. And Jonathan, then I can absolutely bring you in. If Jens, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, please. The time's yours, please.
But what I might do, knowing that some people will have 4 o'clock meetings, can I just say a huge thank you to everyone for joining, and a huge thank you to you, Jens, for speaking and sharing. This is like such important stuff, and it's really just getting us to just do some type 2 thinking about things that we really do care about. And I also would note your paper is very clear on, even if you question the link between poverty and crime, you do underline poverty is good to deal with for the sake of dealing with poverty, which I think is a really important point.
Yeah, thank you. I should have said that. Thank you, Jim.
Not at all. I've heard you say it more than once. Jonathan, let me bring you in and Jens to respond, and then we'll definitely close off. Oh, Jonathan, we can't hear you. I think you are off mute. Ah, that's such a pity. I'm so sorry. What we'd do, Jonathan, because obviously you've got my contacts, I should say Jonathan sits on the oversight board of the YEF, where he plays a key role. Jonathan, if you drop me a note, if Jens doesn't mind, I'll ask you, Jens, and loop back. But Jonathan, I'm sorry that we're struggling to hear you. I'm going to wrap us up then for good. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. And Jens, thanks so much for making the time. And I think I'm seeing you in another Teams chat in a couple of minutes. So I look forward to that.
Perfect.
But thanks so much for joining. Do look out